Hi, my name is Adora Spitak, and today we're going to be looking at a few of my favorite works of art and seeing their relevance, how the themes that are echoed in these works are also seen in modern times. And I think that it is in some ways both haunting and interesting, intriguing really, to see that works of art created decades, even in one case centuries ago, still have extreme meaning today. So here's the first. This is like one of my all-time favorite works. This is Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, and he did it in 1942. Shortly thereafter, it was purchased for $3,000, which was a lot of money then, as it is now, by the Chicago Institute of Art, and it's remained there ever since. And looking at this work, you're kind of struck by the brightness of this diner on the corner, the darkness of the street, but also to some extent the space between them, the isolation, how they're all in this one room and yet extremely apart. Even the man and the woman sitting close together occupy their very own distinct spheres. And if you look at the bartender in here, you'll also notice that this is a really strangely shaped counter in that it's somewhat triangular, and it also begs the question, where does he get out? So there is this whole sense of entrapment and urban isolation in some ways, along with the odd beauty of this diner that is shining on a dark street. So in looking at this painting, perhaps it might seem, okay, this is just kind of this image from the 1940s, but it's really iconic in many ways. You might have seen it actually spoofed on The Simpsons or on t-shirts and lots of other places. And if you ask yourself, where do I see some of those similar elements, this isolation and kind of urban desolation, you'll see it a lot around you. Maybe not necessarily in a bright diner on the corner, but perhaps when everyone's on their phones, typing away, occupying their own very distinct spheres, not really connecting on the same level with the people around them. So in some ways this is a piece of mourning for modern life, I think, but it also, it represents a lot about who we are as people and kind of what we do when we have the chance to be isolated. So the urban isolation theme is kind of also visible in this one. You'll see a lot of these hard kind of geometric lines. It's a little bit different from Nighthawks. Nighthawks is in some ways a little bit softer. This one is during the daytime, so you'll see really how there are these lines. And this man, again, you kind of see the triangular, the entrapment here, and it's the small office in the city. And he's just sitting here working. So I think that if you look at those walls, these white walls, they're kind of devoid of decoration, of personality, and you might ask yourself, what's going on in there, and is his work meaningful? You could ask tons of questions. Obviously, I'm not an expert on this piece in any way, so I'm not going to venture to analyze the composition, but just looking at it and thinking about, how could your work be the same, or how is your parents' work the same, in the sense that we maybe don't personalize things. We feel kind of like smaller parts in a larger machine almost. Now, if we also look at one of my favorite works of art, not a painting at all, rather a book, The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald, an absolute classic. And if you haven't read it already, you definitely have to. I'm very good at forcing books on people. Well, in The Great Gatsby, you'll see that it's in some ways a tragedy of the American dream, but it also speaks a lot of times to hedonism, living for pleasure, and the underlying tragedy that can bring. And it also shows in many ways the soullessness of the world that glitters, the parties, the jewels, all the riches that surround the characters in New York, as well as disparity. In the book, there's a section there are distinct places. There's West Egg and East Egg. East Egg is where all the people with old money live, and West Egg is the place where the nouveau riche are. So there's that difference, but then there's an even bigger disparity, because as you're driving into the city itself, you'll come to a place called the Valley of the Ashes, and that's where the very poor live, the people who run garages, as you'll see in the book, and other things. Not a great place at all. So just that very freakish comparison. You can look at The Great Gatsby and think, well, that's the 1920s, but ask yourself honestly, do I see that around me? And you probably will find that the answer is yes. So disparities, hedonism, all these different qualities about The Great Gatsby that you can see are also definitely visible in society to some extent today. And to end on a cheery note, this was my favorite painting of mine from when I was a very little kid actually, and you might wonder now, what were her parents exposing her to? This is actually a perfectly cool painting. It's by Artemisia Gentileschi. Cool thing about Artemisia Gentileschi, she was one of the first women painters who was well regarded. She followed the Caravaggio style pretty heavily. The difference between Caravaggio's depiction of Judith slaying Holofernes, which is a biblical story, and hers is that Judith actually looks like she's doing the work and she's really putting in the muscle. This is in some ways a very feminist piece. She looks like this strong lady who's slicing a dude's head off. I mean, not that that's what feminism is about, obviously. But actually, there's somewhat a backstory to this. Artemisia Gentileschi was this artist, and unfortunately, when she was a teenager, then her tutor in painting raped her, but she went to court to take him up on this, which was an extremely unusual thing for women to do at this time, keep in mind, because this was still, oh my god, what a shameful thing. And she lost the court case because it was extremely unfair, skewed against women, and it was a really humiliating experience for her. So in this painting, it's been said that actually her face looks somewhat like her own, and that the head is somewhat modeled after that tutor. So it's kind of an interesting work in that it might represent some of her own life, some of her own angst around that, but also that it is in many ways a victory, sort of a celebration of here's what women actually look like if they're slicing people's heads off, and an affirmation of that greater realism to some extent. So looking at that painting, I feel like it has some hope in it, not to mention that it is a kick-ass painting. And so if we think about art not only as, oh look, that's a pretty work, or I like the way that they use colors there, but also how does it speak to me? How does it speak to my life and the world around me? Then we can discover a whole lot about issues that affect us on a daily basis. If we think about feminism, you'll see issues around that in the news every day, around a woman's right to choose, around access to healthcare. It's a huge part of the political debate. If we look at hedonism and riches and disparity, you can see all of that reflected in the news when it comes to talking about even Mitt Romney's wealth, and how does that affect him? How does that make him more or less empathetic? What is the difference between when people say I've been successful versus I am rich, and how people use their riches affect how we see them as well? If we look at the themes of urban isolation, of the worker in the city, or the nighthawks out at the diner, can we ask ourselves, how is that same sense of isolation reflected in our own lives with technology, or however we choose to kind of split ourselves apart or put ourselves into entrapment, into boxes? So I find that all of my favorite works of art really have that commonality, that they hold on to their relevance, they hold on to their meaning, no matter how long ago they may have been made. And I hope that you can find many works of art that do the same for you. Thanks.